Well, I'm going to start off our time together with a question that maybe you wouldn't expect to hear be asked in church, but let's just go ahead and be honest. And that is, do you remember the first time that you got caught swearing out loud? I mean, by show of hands, how many of you were under the age of 13 online? You just go ahead and chat and like, hey, me too. Yeah, I was 6 years old when that happened for me. Here's what happened. I was playing outside, and my then stepdad, he had some buddies over, and they were outside talking, and they were using some colorful language I later learned, and I didn't know all it was saying, but I heard one say the word that starts with the letter F followed by U, and everyone kind of started laughing after that. So, that's a funny thing to say. I like to be a funny kid. And so later that day, I went up to my stepdad and I repeated that thinking he'd laugh, and he just looked at me stunned and just said, if I ever hear you say that word again, I'm going to wash your mouth out with soap. And maybe you heard something similar like that. And so I heard that. I'm like, I don't want to go through that experience. So here's what I did. I made sure that he never heard me say that word again. But he wasn't with me when I was in my high school football locker room, or when I got my first high school maintenance job, or when I was hanging out with my friends on summer break back when I was in high school. Because here's the thing, he never taught me why I shouldn't do that. I just learned I shouldn't do that around him. And my bet is that for many of us, that's the lesson that we learned as well. It's like, hey, I'm just going to watch my behavior and watch what I say around that certain group of people. And that's just a small example of a much bigger thing that we're going to look at today as we're continuing our series called Against the Grain. And what we're doing is we're looking at this question that so many of us have asked. In fact, we just keep asking Google this over and over again because we aren't sure if we're finding the answer that leads to fulfillment. And the question that we're asking Google is, well, how do you know that you're living your best life now? And what Google is telling us and what culture tells us is, hey, here's what you do. You just live for you, and you do you live for your happiness, whatever it takes to make you happy. You live for your pleasure and just follow your heart. But the reason why we keep asking this over and over again is because we do this and we feel empty and unfulfilled because living for ourselves is not a big enough purpose for our life. And so we're wondering, is there another way to experience this fulfillment and to live our best life now? Now, the good news for us is this, is that Jesus' closest friends, one of them, actually gave us a different answer, and it's a better answer. And this answer is driving this series, and here's what John actually said about Jesus. He said, in him is life. Him being Jesus, and that we can live our best life now right through Jesus. And what that means is that whatever is true of Jesus is actually available to be true for us as well. And so what we are doing is we're going on this journey together to learn what this best life in Jesus is like. And this is where we run into a challenge. Because the challenge is that we see that life in Jesus actually goes against the grain of what we may naturally think life and the best life is. But our hope and our prayer is that we will go past the challenge and we will discover what it's like to have this best life in Jesus. And so if you're new with us, or if you missed any of those previous weeks, or if you just found us on YouTube, I want to encourage you to go back to our YouTube playlist and find that in the channel. All of the previous parts of this are there. You can watch and catch up and share that with a friend. But here's where we're going today. Today, we're going to look at another against the grain idea that is true of Jesus, that he wants to be true of us as well. And this is actually how we can begin to experience this life change and experience the best life in Jesus. And we're going to look at, where do you start to have life change? And where we start, this really goes against the grain, because our culture and the culture that Jesus was in said, here's how you begin to change your life. You start out here with your behavior, or you start out here with someone else's behavior, and you just change them, and you get to change this behavior, and everything will work out well as a result of that. But the challenge is this, is that like how my stepdad taught me not to swear in front of him, I didn't really change who I was. It just changed my behavior around him. And this approach to change is actually what psychologists call behavior modification. And what behavior modification means is you just change your behavior to either avoid something bad or you just get something good. And we've all done some type of behavior modification before. I mean, for many of us, it may be this. Guys, you saw her. You thought she was kind of cute. You wanted to ask her out and get her on a date. And so you changed your behavior. You're on your best behavior to get her to notice you so that you could go on a date and then get a second date and a third date. Or all of us, we saw a job that we wanted. We applied for the job. They called us in for an interview. We go in for the interview. What do? We be on our best behavior so that we can perform well in the interview and hopefully get the job because we would love to get that job. Or, hey, parents, teachers, leaders, we use behavior modification as a way to raise our kids or to teach the students or to lead those that we've employed so that they would go and do what we want them to do. I mean, there's times we need to use behavior modification. I mean, we do this in our home with our kids. We have punishments and we have rewards based on their behavior. Now, there's times that this is going to be necessary, but behavior modification does not lead to lasting life change. And here's how we know this. Have you ever met a person and met them for some time, and then over time you were surprised at an action or something that they revealed came out and you just couldn't believe that was that person? I've had that happen in my life where I've had some family members eventually reveal to me that there were years of extramarital affairs that happened. And it's just, whoa. You know, there were people in my life, some pastors and some other friends in my life that I've looked up to that have lost their ministries and have lost relationships due to years of hidden alcohol abuse or years of just mistreating other people. And here's what I've noticed every single time that happened. Someone near to the situation saw this happen and they said, I couldn't believe that about that person. That's not them. Well, the truth is, that was them. They learned how to modify their behavior, that they behaved in a certain way around certain groups of people to think that they were going to be fine because they're trying to avoid something bad and get something good. But what happened was it wasn't just what was happening on the outside. What we realized is the inside, it actually spilled out and they were caught up in that behavior, and that was what happened. That's why Jesus says, hey, hold on. We can't start here on the outside when it comes to life change. We have to start somewhere else, and that sets us up for today's Against the Grain idea. He gives us a different starting point to experience real life change and the best life in Him. This is explained in actually an interaction that He has with this group of religious leaders known as the Pharisees. It's actually found in Matthew chapter 15, and before we jump into what Jesus says, let me just set it up a little bit. In the beginning of the chapter, what happens is these religious leaders, the Pharisees, they come up to Jesus and they accuse Him of breaking a rule. And they said, Jesus, you broke a big rule. You didn't wash your hands before you ate a meal. And they called him out on this, and this isn't because they're germaphobes. You know, they had this religious rule that they were trying to follow, and this was this ritual hand washing before a meal. And they said Jesus and his closest followers didn't follow this ritualistic hand washing ceremony before they participated in a meal of some type. And what's going on is that the religious leaders, they're following these two different types of laws. There's this written law that they have, which was given to them from God. In the nation of Israel, they had this written law. It's now known as our Old Testament. It described how God wanted to have this unique relationship with the nation of Israel then. And there was so much contained in this written law that they didn't want to break what was in here. So these religious leaders created what's now called the oral law, or the spoken law. And the spoken law was actually designed to actually create these rules that if they followed these rules, they would keep them from breaking the rules of the written law. Now, you don't exactly know what was all in the oral law because it wasn't obviously written down. It was just spoken from one generation to another generation. It's like the unwritten rules of baseball. You just kind of have to know what they are. And so what's going on is the religious leaders, they go around the town and they just kind of watch different people and they just catch them in their behavior. And they say, hold on, you broke a rule here. You can't do that. Or you should do this. And what they're doing is they're trying to change everyone's behavior to get them good with God. And so that's exactly what they're doing to Jesus, and they're saying, hey, you broke this hand-washing rule. Now, Jesus has a problem with the oral law. And the big problem that he has is that the religious leaders took this law, they took it to a place that God never intended to go, and they made it all about behavior, and they went past God's intentions. And then Jesus, he calls them out on this, and he gives them a really big example of how they've actually misused this law. And what he tells them, he says, hey, you guys are taking advantage of your parents. And he calls them out for what they're doing. These religious leaders have these parents that are aging, they're financially unstable, and it's supposed to be onto these leaders to provide support for their parents. But they don't want to do that. And so what they do is they go through the ceremony to take their money and promise it to God and say, hey, God, we're going to give this to you someday to exempt themselves from taking care of their parents, and they're leaving their parents out to dry. And Jesus says, no, that's not okay. And that sets us up for where we get our against the grain idea today, because Jesus, he just calls them out for how they're treating these rules and behavior modification. Here's what Jesus says to them. You hypocrites! Meaning, you're actually an actor. He's saying you are pretending to follow God. He says Isaiah was right. Isaiah was this prophet who spoke for God 700 years before Jesus and the religious leaders were on earth. And he says Isaiah was right when he foretold about you. He said these people honor me with their lips, literally lip service. It's like when your kid comes up to you and they just start sweet talking you and just telling you how great of a dad you are, but you know full well they want that extra dessert or that extra toy. I mean, but that's what they're doing here. He says, there's the lip service. You're honoring me with your lips, but their hearts are far from me. And this is what Jesus says is the big issue. This is what he cares about. He doesn't care about behavior modification because he knows that doesn't lead to lasting life change. For Jesus, he says, this is where we're going to start. The heart is the heart of the matter. Now, when Jesus talks about the heart, he is not talking about our physical heart. He is not talking about the feelings that we have, that can change any and every day, that we say, hey, just follow those feelings. No, what Jesus is talking about is actually the very core of who we are. Dallas Willard, who is a pastor and theologian and author before he passed away, he actually described the heart this way that I think is just so helpful. He writes and says, the heart is not feelings, but refers to it being the center or core of the human being and the part to which every other component of the self owes its proper functioning. Our heart is our command center. Everything that we do flows from our heart. Or if you think about it this way, if you were to think about your phone, think about the operating system that runs your phone. I mean, are you a team iPhone or are you a team Android? And whatever team you are on, this, is that your phone and the apps that you can download and the way that you can use them is determined by the operating system on your phone. And that's what our heart is. Our heart is our operating system. Everything we do flows from our heart. And this is how Jesus is going against the grain. He says, here's what I know culture does. Culture says if you want to experience your best life now, you don't start with your heart, because we live in a culture that says follow your heart and be true to your heart, because there's nothing wrong with the condition of your heart. So if we want to experience life change, we change what's going on outside of here. And we change our behavior, or we change our appearance, or we change our jobs, or we change our relationships, and we hope that will bring us our best life now. But Jesus says, no. The heart is the heart of the issue. If we want to experience true life change, our best life now, we have to start by looking at the condition of our heart. He says the heart is what matters. And then he tells us why it matters this much. He calls to the crowd, and he said to them, hey, listen and understand, which really is Jesus just kind of jabbing at these religious leaders again, because that's all that they do, spending their time. He says, I know that you've learned this, but you haven't lived this out. He says, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, which means creating distance or separation from God. He's saying these rules and rituals you're following, they're not doing anything for you. but rather what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them, because everything flows from our heart. And so the words that we say and how we treat others and what we say to others, that has the ability to create this distance that we feel from God. And so Jesus says we have to start with the heart. And this goes so against the grain of the culture back then, because they were just so focused on rules and religious rituals that Jesus' closest followers, they didn't get this at first. And so later, they actually pulled Jesus aside and they said, Jesus, you got to help us understand what you mean. What are you telling us here? And so Jesus, he tells them again. He says, don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? And every first grade boy like my son would say, yeah, Jesus, that's our favorite thing to talk about. Absolutely. But Jesus is bringing this up again. He says, it's not about what you eat and the religious rules you're trying to follow and all the behavior you're trying to do outside of here. He says, it's not about that. What I care about is something so much different and better. He says, but the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, the core of who we are, and these defile them. And Jesus is going back to this idea. He says, here's why this matters so much. Everything we do flows from our command center. And you can try to out-behavior, modify, and follow these rules and try to, do some things to get something good and avoid these things bad. But he says there's a principle that's always going to be at play. And why we want to pay attention to the condition of our heart is because here's what's true of all of us, is that our actions are going to eventually reflect the conditions of our hearts. That what comes outside of us is going to be a pure reflection of what's going on inside of us. This is why when we see that person, they come out and they said, hey, this has been going on for several months or several years, and we were just so surprised by it. Jesus was never surprised by it because he knew what was going on in the heart. He knew the core of what was going on. He knew the condition of the heart, and he knew that what is going on in our heart is eventually going to be reflected outside of us. We can't get away from this principle. Our actions will eventually reflect the conditions of what's going on inside of us. And then Jesus gives some examples of what that looks like. He says, for out of the heart actually come evil thoughts, meaning it's going to leak. Our hearts are like bad plumbing. What's inside will come outside. It's just a matter of time. And then he gives this list of examples. He says murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. He says these are what create distance between God and a person. And what Jesus is getting to is he says, I want you to think about all of these things and how they impact other people. That's why we want to start with the conditions of our hearts, because what Jesus cares about the most is how we actually treat other people. And we're going to actually talk about that more later throughout the series, about how a follower of Jesus actually reflects that commitment to love Jesus by loving others. But Jesus says we have to start with the starting point. We have to look at what's going on inside, because the core of who we are, it is our heart. And eventually what happens inside of here is going to spill out over here. And that's why Jesus says we have to go against the grain, and we have to look and experience life change in our heart. That's why Jesus cares so much about our heart. And so here's the against the grain principle that we want to put into practice. And this will go against the grain of a culture that says, just follow your heart. No, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we take care of our heart. And so the principle that we're going to put into practice is we're going to regularly nurture the health of your heart. Now, I'm hitting the age, actually close to 40, I know, where I'm starting to see people in my life deal with some physical heart problems. Over the past 12 months, I've had 3 friends and family members close to me actually have to be hospitalized for heart-related conditions, and they'd go through the hospital and they get their treatment, they get taken care of, and then every single one of them came out and said, I need to do some things to take care of my heart now and just make sure that my heart is healthy. And I'm watching them go through it. I'm thinking, hey, as I'm getting older, I don't want to go through what they went through, so I got to pay attention to my heart and make sure that I'm taking care of my physical heart and doing the things that they're doing, because taking care of that is really important because our body depends on it. And while that's important, the core of who we are, our operating system, this heart, is even more important, because what we do inside is going to be reflected on the outside. And so we're going to break this down. We're going to regularly, not in an annual checkup, on a regular, ongoing basis, we're going to nurture, take care of the health of our heart. We want the condition of our heart to reflect the condition of Jesus' heart, because when we do this, we experience our best life now in Him. And so, how does this work? Well, it works very similar to how we take care of our physical hearts. Heart doctors and those who have spent time with them would tell you that generally taking care of our physical heart comes down to these 2 practices. We're going to keep pollutants out by not smoking or not taking drugs or not eating an overwhelming amount of unhealthy food in order to keep our heart healthy that way. And then here's another thing we're going to do. We're going to give the heart exactly what it needs. We'll give it some regular cardiovascular exercise. We'll eat some heart healthy food, and we'll do what we can to keep our heart healthy so that our body would overall stay healthy. Well, we could actually take that same principle in place to keep our heart healthy and nurture the health of our heart so that we can experience this life change from Jesus. And so we're going to take this similar practice, and John Tyson, who's a pastor out in New York, he does a brilliant job of just breaking this down into what we need is a defensive plan and an offensive plan to nurture the health of our heart. So we'll start with the defensive plan. How do we keep the pollutants out and away from our heart? Well, what we want to identify is what the pollutant is, and that pollutant is what we can refer to as idols. Now, I'm not saying American Idol. Whatever, that might be fine. No, our culture generally doesn't talk about idols a whole lot. When we hear the word idol, we might think of like this statue or this temple in a country that's far away. And while those could be idols, they aren't the only idols. A definition of an idol is this: it's anything that we make more important than God. And it can literally be anything. And if we put it ahead of God in its place, it can become an idol and take our heart away from God. And so a great way to identify what might be an idol in your life is to just go through the simple exercise that Tyson gives. And that simple exercise is this: fill in the blank. Life has meaning and I have worth if blank. And you fill in that blank. You answer honestly. I mean, this is similar to the exercise that we took in week 1 of this series, where we said, hey, in blank, I find life. What would you honestly put in that blank? Life has meaning and I have worth if I have that position, I have that respect, that power, I have that relationship, I have that experience. What would you put? Get real honest with yourself. What would you put in that blank? And I took this exercise, and there was a number of different things that I actually ended up putting in that blank, and I'll just highlight 2 of them, although there were more than 2 of them. I wrote down one of them is like my standard of living. And I don't have a lavish life, but I enjoy having what I have to be able to provide for my family and take care of them and be able to see that provision. And any time that anything kind of comes against that or could threaten that, it stresses me out. I get worried about it. Another thing I wrote down was actually my physical health. And I like having the ability to play with my kids and being able to enjoy sports like running and weightlifting. And I like being able to do things and not be slowed down by my physical health. The idea of like losing that actually just freaks me out, where I'm like, oh, I'm not so sure about that. And what we do with those blanks is we realize that they could be potential idols and that we're putting them ahead of God in our life. And so what we want to do is we want to confess that to God, and we want to turn from those idols and ask him to keep those idols away from our heart. And so what that looks like is we just tell God, I put this ahead of you. And I realize that you have been the great gift giver. You've given me great gifts, but I've been holding on to the gifts more than you as the gift giver. And so God, if this is keeping me from you, take it away from me. If you need to show me that you are the only thing that I have and that's all that I'm enough, God, that's okay. Take these idols and remove them from me. And we just keep those pollutants away from us. But we can't just get rid of those and stop there. We have to fill it up with something else. And this goes to the offensive plan to nurture the health of our heart. And what we do to do this is we cultivate a hunger for the things of God. And a hunger is just this deep desire and this deep craving to just see God move and to experience the things of God. And one of the things that John Tyson says I think is so helpful is that the greatest enemy of hunger for God is not poison, but apple pie. Meaning we can be tempted to fill ourselves up with so many good things that we aren't full. There's no room left for the things of God in our life. And so, for example, for some of us, we might say this, hey, I want to go after that position at work, and I'm going to go after it. And I know it's going to require a ton of time. I don't have room to join a Ridge group or serve on a team because I'm just going to be so full of just going after this position. Or, hey, my kid, they signed up for basketball, and basketball season is going to go for 4 months. And I'm sorry, we're not going to be at church, for 4 months. We're going to check out. Maybe we can try to check up online if that works out, but we're just going to go ahead and fill ourselves up with that. And we're filling ourselves up with something that are not the things of God. And again, they're not bad things. But when we're filled up with that, it doesn't leave room for the hunger for the things of God. And so what I want us to remember is the words of Jesus. When Jesus said, hey, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. He says, for they will actually be filled. They'll be satisfied. You are better off when you hunger for the things of God, because being filled, being satisfied, that is experiencing the best life in Jesus. I kind of think of it like this. Think of a sports team, and they talk about the hunger that they have for a championship. And we hear Giannis talk about this a lot with the Bucks. And they say, we're so hungry to win that it's our focus, it's our desire. We're going to go after this so much that we're going to take care of our bodies. We're going to work on our craft. We're going to work on our skills. We're not going to let the distractions distract us because we are going to be so focused on winning. And that's what cultivating a hunger for God looks like. That says every day we're going to wake up, God, I want to be hungry for you. And because I'm hungry for you, I want to be driven by this vision to bring the hope of Jesus into every home, because I've experienced the best life in Jesus, and I want to share that with others, and I want them to experience this life in Jesus. Or, hey, God, I'm going to wake up, and I'm going to be so hungry for you that whatever it is that you want to do in me and through me, the answer is yes. I don't even need to know what it is right now. The answer is yes. I'm going to follow you because I'm so hungry to see you move. And that can even be that first step. Say, Jesus, make me more hungry for you. Because you say that I'm going to be better off and I'm going to be filled when I hunger for the things of God. God, just make me hungry and fill me with the things for you, because I want to see you move. And so how's your heart? Really? I know it goes against the grain to talk about the idea of taking care of our heart, because we just live in a culture that says, hey, just follow your heart. Just listen to your heart. Don't worry. Whatever it is, you do you. But Jesus says, no, this is the starting point. We have to go against the grain. We have to look at the condition of our heart. And the condition of our heart is healthy when the condition of our heart reflects the heart of Jesus. And so let's nurture the health of our heart. Let's tell God, get rid of those pollutants. Get rid of those idols. God, give me that hunger for you. And when we do, our heart falls in line with him, and we experience that life change in Jesus, because what happens is we have a hunger for him that's reflected on the outside, because what happens in here is reflected out there. And so let's just ask Jesus to give us his heart. Would you pray with me? Right now, God, this is our desire. God, we want to be hungry for you, and we want you to just move in us in a way that you would change our hearts. And so, God, I pray that as we look at the things that are taking us away from you and distracting us from you, God, would you just remove those idols and tear those down? And God, it's going to feel painful at first because it's so against the grain. And God, we may even wonder, hey, that doesn't feel like that's life, but Jesus, you have something so much better for us. And that's you. And you want us to experience you. And so, God, I pray that we would do this, that you would remove those idols, you remove those things that are just damaging our heart. And God, that you would replace it for a hunger for you. God, we want to see you move. We want to see you move in us and through us. And Jesus, we pray that as you do that, you would just transform us in a way that we would just be ultimately satisfied because we are finding our purpose in you. Because Jesus, you came to give us that full life. And we're not going to experience that full life, that best life now in anything else that is not of you. And so we just commit to you right now. Would you just change our hearts and give us these healthy hearts? And we find that in you, Jesus. We love you. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.